Well, good morning again, church, as we pick up here at Acts 27. And some of you that you may read ahead or see where we're going, because obviously as we go book by book, verse by verse, you can figure out where we're going week to week, right? Unless God does something weird and there's a one-off. You sort of knew when you left here last week at Acts 26 that chances are we were going to be at 27 this week. And you might have looked at 27 and said, well, it's just a sailing story. Like, we know Sean's family likes boats and going on trips like that, but, what's really the point behind this thing? And so stick with me as we kind of look at this and see what happens here this week as we see what's going to happen. Because we've come off of Paul's sort of court appearances as far as that goes with Festus and Agrippa and all these others. And as we left off last week, it said, they flat out said, if he had not applied to Caesar, we just let him go. Right? But Paul had pulled that card out and applied and just said, hey, I'm done with this. We're just going straight to Caesar. I'm going to use my Roman privilege. I'm going to say I want to appeal in front of Caesar, who's going to decide whether I live or die, and this is what's going to happen. But all these other lower courts have sort of said, well, if you hadn't done that, we don't have anything to hold you on, right? We're just going to let this go. This was after the pandering to the court of all the Jewish leadership before, where they were saying, the Jewish leadership was sort of saying, hey, we know you're smart, we don't want to make this take a long time, and you're just such a good listener, and you take care of everything, we're just going to pander and kind of kiss up to you, and you just let us kill this guy, right? That's what we want to do. Just sort of be nice and just throw that in the end. We want to murder this guy, and so you just let us do what we want because you're just nice and awesome. And since that hasn't happened, finally Paul says, I'm done with this. We're just going to apply straight to Caesar. And now we get to this point where Paul has to get to Caesar, right? And it's easy for us sometimes, we think in our American sort of life, especially, it's interesting sometimes the way you measure things based on where you live, right? Us in Texas, we don't measure things on miles, right? What do we measure by in the state of Texas? Hours, right? Like somebody says, well, I want to go to Dallas. Well, that's 5 hours, right? Or if I want to go to Austin, well, that's 73 hours depending on the state of traffic and what highway you take, right? Or, if I want to go to El Paso, then, we know that's 9 days, and why do you want to go to El Paso, right? Are you in the military? Then why? Like, if you're not in the military, why? Do you have family? Right? Certain places in Texas, right? Penny's here today, so I can say Odessa, right? Going to Odessa, well, do you have a job or family there? No. Then why? Like, it's not a vacation destination, right? We say the same thing. Having moved from there, we look at, people say, oh, we're going to Houston. We're like, oh, you've got family there. And they're like, or you're leaving out on a cruise or no, we're just going to, why? Why would you do that? It doesn't make sense. It does not compute in my brain why you would do this. But we think about that and we realize things take a certain amount of time, hours, and that's how we measure. We measure in hours. In fact, I remember a discussion between my wife and I. We were driving and we were going to Indiana, and I think it was it for my grandmother's funeral when we had this discussion? I think it was, because I think it was the first time she went up there with me. We were driving up for my grandmother's funeral, and for us to get into Indiana where my sisters live, they live on the very eastern edge of Indiana, Richmond, Hagerstown, that sort of area. It's right on the border of Ohio. And so, but the fastest way to get there is actually to drive up through Illinois and then drive across the state. That's the fastest, most direct route as you can do it. And I remember as we're driving up, she goes, why are we doing that? Why are we going to drive across? Why don't we go on the other side? Go up through Kentucky and get there because you're going to spend 2 days driving across. I said, wait a minute. You are measuring Indiana based on Texas. I said, once we hit the border of Illinois and Indiana, it's literally an hour and a half from there to the other side of the state. Like this is not Texas, right? This is narrow. And so but again, I didn't tell her in miles. What did I say? It's an hour and a half. Because we don't measure miles around here, right? And in fact, one of the funny things we used to say when we lived in Houston, when you would leave from Houston to drive to Disneyland in California, does anybody know what halfway is? Between Houston, Texas and Disneyland? El Paso. Once you hit El Paso, Texas, you are halfway. We don't measure things based on miles. So when we look at this, we kind of have the idea of thinking, oh, well, he's going to sail to Rome, and we've been out on a fishing boat, or we've done this before, it's just a couple hours. No, this is going to be a long journey. This is going to take time. He's going to be on this ship for a while. And when we think about this, don't think pleasure cruise, right? Because he's not traveling as paid guest. He's traveling as arrested prisoner. They're not putting him in a stateroom with a window and room service. Those of you that have cruised before know what I'm talking about, right? You're not even interior cruise ship, right? Like some of you think interior, I don't want to do that. That's not even this. This is in the bottom of the ship, chained to the ship. dealing with everything that would come from being on a ship like that. The animals, the smells, all the things you don't want to think about. That's what we're talking about here. Right? And for a while. And so we see, when it was decided, this is verse 1, when it was decided that we were to sail to Italy, they handed over Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion named Julius, one of the imperial regiment. That means he typically worked inside of Rome. He was probably one of the ones that was nearby Caesar. And so he's been given over to this guy, and that guy's been told, this is your responsibility. If he doesn't make it back to Caesar, this is all on you. Right? Because if you were a Roman centurion and they gave you a mission, this wasn't so much if you had a dereliction of duty, you might do some time in prison, Leavenworth or whatever. This is, if you don't hold up your end, we're going to kill you in their place. So this guy better make it, and he better be in fairly good health by the time he gets there, or else. So he's handed over to this guy and says, so when we had boarded a ship to Adriatic, we put to sea, intending to sail to ports along the coast of the province of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to receive their care. So Julius here has already built, you can imagine what we know about Paul, right? This has only been a few days, but anything we know about Paul is that if he's got one chance or one opportunity with somebody, what's about to happen? They're going to hear about Jesus. And so you can imagine that Julius, this entire time, Paul's been talking about Jesus. Hey, did you know about Jesus? Did you know he did this? Did you know he did that? Did you... And you can imagine Julius at this point is probably thinking what? I don't care where you go. Just go away. I'm done. Right? Parents really like that one, right? Like you've had that moment. Let's be honest with ourselves, parents. You've had that moment with your children where you have said, regardless of how old they are, you have told them what? I don't care where you go. Just go away from me right now, right? Just go away for your health and my freedom. Go away, right? Go to the other side of the house. Go do something. Just go. Give me a moment. And so you can imagine here Julius is probably saying that, hey, just go. I know you're going to come back. Just go. And so he leaves, and it says, when we had put out to sea from there, obviously he comes back, we sailed along the northern coast of Cyprus because the winds were against us. After sailing through the open sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we reached Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. So we see here, we're leaving one ship, moving to another ship, but what we're seeing here is the passage of time. This is days, weeks of travel on this ship. There, the centurion found the Alexandrian ship sailing slowly for many days. We came with difficulty as far as Cnidus. But since the wind did not allow us to approach it, we sailed along the south side of Crete off Salmone. Yet with more difficulty, we sailed along the coast and came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lycia. And so what we see here is it's getting to become a difficult journey, and where they're sailing is what we would call now the Adriatic. And if you ever study the Adriatic at wintertime, it is not a place you want to be on the water unless you really trust your sailing skills or you have a very serious ship. And what we know about shipbuilding back then is some of their ships were pretty serious, but they're not going to hold up over a winter storm season with the rocks and the things that are there. It's you either get where you're getting or you find a spot and you stick there until the weather is better. And some of you that are serious fishermen, you may have been in that place before where you've been out on the water and you look up and all of a sudden realize making it back to the boat ramp is no longer an option. What do you have to then do? You got to find the safest place you can and do what? Wait it out, right? Hope you make it, just ride it out. As difficult and as scary as it might be. You find a spot, you wait. That's what you do. And so we see here, verse 9, by now much time had passed and the voyage was already dangerous. Since the fast was already over, Paul gave his advice and told them, men, I can see that this voyage is headed towards damage and heavy loss, not only of the cargo of the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion paid attention to the captain and the owner of the ship rather than to what Paul said. We notice here, we pause right there. Don't skip over this little section, because to me, and as I read and studied through this, this is what I kind of understand in this, is that Paul had made some inroads with this guy, that he was even allowed to speak. And that the centurion even thought about what Paul was saying. He didn't go with him yet, but he didn't just stamp Paul down and say, no, you don't speak, we don't listen to you. So Paul's making inroads here. And you can imagine Paul, being who Paul is to this point, sort of sees this and goes, I'm not there yet with you. It just means I need to work harder. So now we're going to double down on the Jesus talk and everything else because I've made inroads with you. And so we see this. Paul, he doesn't yet listen to Paul, but 12. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, and for those of you that have studied old sailing, that's what you would do. You'd find a safe harbor, you'd park the ship for the winter, you'd live there for the winter, and then when spring rolled around, you'd leave. And so they're trying to find a place they can do that. The majority decided to set sail from here, hoping somehow to reach Phoenix, a harbor on Crete open to the southwest and northwest, and to winter there. Now, for those of you in here that are skilled boatsmen, fishermen, that you do all that, I can't imagine you've ever been in a situation where you think, I just need to leave my boat here for the winter, and we'll try again in the spring. I mean, maybe for major repairs, you might do that, but you've never been out on the bay and just assumed, I'll just anchor it here, and then by the time I come back in the winter, there'll still be a boat, right? It doesn't happen nowadays. And so they have to try to get here, but they're already knowing that this is probably not going to go well. Right? They're hoping against the worst. Now think about us in humanity. How often do we find ourselves doing that? Knowing that the situation is probably going to blow up in our face, but what do we do anyway? Charge right in, expecting the opposite. Right? You see this all the time. You hear it sometimes, and it's accredited to a bunch of different people, but the idea being, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. If you close the mousetrap, put your hand in it, and it snaps your hand, and you continue to do it over and over again, it is no longer the mousetrap's fault. Right? In teaching this week in the sub-journey, I spent the last 2 days in the gym. I was a gym teacher, right? And so teaching gym, what they've been working on in gym is basketball, particularly with the younger ones, dribbling. And one of the things we have to tell these kids over and over again, because you'll see these little ones, the second graders and third graders especially, they'll begin to dribble and the ball will take off left and right, or they'll dribble off their foot and they'll yell at the ball. Right? It's the ball's fault, which some of these balls in there, it might be, right? There's some goose eggs and dimples, so you have to pull those out and get them a better one. But we have to have a lesson. I had to talk with some of these kids and sit them down, and I put the ball down and go, where's that ball going to go? Pending there's no wind or the floor is level, that ball will only go where I tell it to. Right? As I begin dribbling and going between my hands, that ball is going to go exactly where I tell it. Yet so often in our humanity, we will do things like that, and then when it doesn't go our way, we'll blame the thing like we didn't know better. And so we see here, they're hoping against hope, knowing this is probably going to end poorly. Yet they do it anyway. And so we see this, 13. When a gentle south wind sprang up, they thought they had achieved purpose. Right? We've all been there before too, right? We hope against hope. We start doing the thing we're not supposed to do anyway. And then at first, it starts to go well, and what do we think? I've beaten the odds, right? Yes, I win. But then we see this. They weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete, but not long after, a fierce wind called the nor'easter, right? That should sound common for us, especially as we come into February. And if you've looked at the long-range weather for next week, what Thursday and Friday might look like around here, okay? Rushed down from the island. Since the ship was caught and unable to head into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Which, if any of you have ever sailed, what's the problem there? Right? And there's one of you in here I know can answer that question, Cal. If you're sailing a ship and you can't be with the wind and you have to be at the mercy of the wind, chances are your ship's going to end up at the bottom of whatever body of water it's in. It will beat your ship to death. It will sink you. It will kill you. One of the things I learned in the times that Courtney and I worked at camp, I spent a summer as a lifeguard. And as I was taking the lifeguarding classes, and we had boats that would drive, and so for those kiddos that are going to camp this summer, they still have this there. So if you're going to camp as a kid, or even as an adult, you might want to listen right now. They have a thing called banana sleds, which are inflatable sleds pulled behind a speedboat, and they drag you around. And I did my best to try to drown children. That's They had life jackets on so you couldn't actually drown them, but that's the whole point. If you're driving the boat, you just want to launch these children as far as you can, right? You're counting them as they go across the water. You're skipping them like rocks. 1, 2, 3, right? You're just doing that. But one of the things we learned in our lifeguarding class is they would tell us, the water wants to kill you. You have to stop it from killing you. That's what it wants to do. That's its purpose. That's what you have to think about as a lifeguard. The water's purpose is to kill whoever you're lifeguarding. You have to have that on your mind at all times. And so when we do this, that's what I had to have in mind, and that's what I think about when I read this, that as they're doing this, the water's purpose, right? And that'd be like them like, oh, why is the water doing this to us? The water's doing what the water does. That's why you hear me talk about sin like juggling snakes. When we play with sin, and we equate that to juggling snakes, and then we get bit by the snake, and we try to blame the snake for doing what it does. That's its purpose. That's its mission. And so we see here when the water begins to do what the water does, it's not the water's fault. It's the fault of those that would go out there expecting a different result, knowing what was going to happen. It's the same thing for us today. When we do things, knowing what the result will end up being, knowing that it's not of God, it's things that aren't of what He's called us to do, and it blows up in our face, and then we try to blame Him like He should have bailed us out of our bad decisions. And so we see this. After running under the shelter of a little island called Calda, we were barely able to get control of the skiff. After hoisting it up, they used ropes and tackle and girded the ship. Then, fearing they would run aground on Syrtis, they lowered the drift anchor, and in this way they were driven along, trying to slow themselves down. That's what they're doing. They're lowering this anchor just to slow down the ship. Because we were being severely battered by the storm, they began to jettison the cargo. The next day, on the third day, they threw the ship's gear overboard with their own hands. So we see here they're lightening the load, but as they're doing this, they're getting rid of the very things they're going to need to keep themselves alive. Humanity, we as humanity do the same things today. In the midst of fear and panic, we make bad decisions. Obviously, I've talked about it before, I'm a movie guy. One of the greatest lines in the movie Men in Black, said by Tommy Lee Jones. A person is smart. People are dumb, dangerous, panicky animals. Right? We exactly are. If the last 2 years have not proved that to you, I don't know what will. An individual can be smart. People are squirrels. Right? We are squirrels. You give us a reason to hoard something, and guess what we do? We hoard. Toilet paper, dumb stuff, right? Toilet paper, paper towels. Like, what are you going to do with a garage full of toilet paper? Right? Pass it down to your grandchildren? That's what's going to happen. Squirrels. Right? Not you hear people, oh, the sheeple. No, we're not sheep, we're squirrels. We're just looking for stuff to hoard. That's all we're doing. Left to our own devices. Because humanity, dumb, dangerous, panicky animals. And we see this. The very things they need to save their lives, they're jettisoning it. They're throwing it overboard. For many days, neither sun nor stars appeared, and the severe storm kept raging. Finally, all hope that we would be saved was disappearing. Since many were going without food, Paul stood up among them and said, "You men should have followed my advice not to sail from Crete and sustain this damage and loss." I love Paul for this, right? This is Paul. This is one of the few times you see Paul say what? I told you so. Right? Why are you at? And this is exactly it. Like, you knew this was going to happen. I told you this was going to happen, yet here we are. Right? Parents, right? Most parents, when they hear that verse, they love that verse, right? This is the, I told you this is what was going to happen, and here we are. Surprise. In fact, it's all of humanity. We see that. And so we see, 22, now I urge you to take courage, because there will be no loss of any of your lives, but only of the ship. For this night an angel of God I belong to stood and said, the angel of the God I belong to and serve stood by me, saying, "Don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and look, God has graciously given you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore take courage, men, because I believe God, that it will be just the way it was told to me. However, we must run aground on a certain island." And what I have, I earmark and write certain things in my scripture here. And what I have marked up here at the top says, not much detail. You imagine in this situation what Paul is saying, hey, we're going to live, we got to make it to this island. You imagine being on that ship in the middle of what's going on, in the middle of the chaos, and this guy stands up and says that. The first words out of your mouth are going to be what? How do you know? How do you have any idea what's about to? You're a prisoner. You're locked in the bottom of the ship. Now you're telling us we're going to live, but we're going to lose the ship? What I have after that says equals trust. In our lives, God does not always paint us the entire picture up front. He requires us to trust Him. To understand that He is the God of the details, the big and the small. We need to trust in that. As scary as it seems, in the midst of the chaos and the struggle of everything around us, to trust that He is the God of the detail. So we get to 27. When the 14th night came, we were drifting in the Adriatic Sea, and in the middle of the night, the sailors thought that they were approaching land. They took a sounding and found it to be 120 feet deep. When they had sailed farther, they sounded again, found it to be 90 feet. Then, fearing we might run aground in some rocky place, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight to come. Better to move in the light than try to find something in the dark. That's what they're doing. 30. Some sailors tried to escape from the ship. They had let down the skiff into the sea, pretending that they were going to put out anchors from the bow. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Don't miss what verse 32 says. Then the soldiers cut the ropes holding the skiff and let it drop away. What do we know has happened at this point? They're believing in what Paul has told them. They're coming to faith in the God Paul has told them about. Paul's accomplishing his mission. These men who were soldiers and citizens of Rome and believers in Rome are becoming believers of God. Because why else would they cut those ropes and let those boats leave if they didn't believe what Paul had said? And so often sometimes we read Scripture and we sort of glean past stuff that if you're not careful, you miss the aha moment. And we begin to look at this at 27 and you kind of go, well, what's the point? They cut the ropes. Because Paul told them, this is what God said. And those soldiers cut the ropes and let those skiffs go. How often are we willing to cut the ropes? Even though everything in you is saying, do it your way. Where God says, nope, cut the rope. Trust me. We follow with this. It was just about daylight. Paul urged them to take food, saying, today is the 14th day that you've been waiting and going without food, having eaten nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for this has to do with your survival, since not a hair will be lost from the head of any of you. After he said these things, had taken some bread, gave thanks to God in the presence of them all, and when he had broken it, he began to eat. They all became encouraged and took food themselves. In all, there were 276 of us on the ship. And having eaten enough food, they began to lighten the ship by throwing the grain overboard into the sea. Paul is caring for the flock that's been placed under him. When Paul stepped on this ship, he did not view it as a place of persecution or struggle. He viewed it as a target of opportunity. A flock placed under him, a captive audience, if you will. Right? I say this all the time, that if I can catch somebody in the right situation, they're a captive audience. They can't go anywhere, I've got them. If you can't get away from me, guess what? We're going to talk about Jesus. Right? If I've got you, I've got you. Here we go. Paul here knowing, I've got 275, because Paul's one of them, right? He doesn't, Paul's there. He's already there. He's got 275 captive audience members that, guess what? You can't go anywhere. We're on this ship. Guess what you're going to hear about for the entire time I'm here? Here we go. Paul caring for the flock under him, but more importantly, he's loving that flock under him. If you were here Wednesday or in Sunday school this morning, one of the other big aha moments I had this week in the sub-journey, and Courtney and I have talked about this and shared it with some of the other teachers up there, that there is a difference between love and tolerate. We are called as believers to love. And trust me, the world, and especially children, can tell the difference between love and tolerate. This week at the school, there was a thing called map testing. And teachers will groan and grumble, and counselors, I'm sure Cassie hates that word as well. It's not a fun thing. For those of you that don't know what map testing is, at the beginning of the year, children are given a test. It baselines them to see where they're at the beginning of the year. Then at the middle of the year, they take this test again to see if they've grown in these areas or gone backwards. And then at the end of the year, they're going to take it again to see where we've ended the year at, right? And so what we've noticed, or what Courtney noticed, at least in her grade level, is there was some great success. And some of the teachers were wondering about that. There was two we ended up talking with after the testing was done, and they're saying, we just don't, like they've grown by leaps and bounds. We're amazed, we're excited, and they're basically saying they don't understand how it happened, right? Teachers are self-deprecating, right? Pastors are self-deprecating, teachers are self-deprecating. They never feel like they do enough. They never feel like there's enough there. And so they're amazed that these kids have gone up, right? There's just huge growth, and one little boy, it was amazing. He's walking around recess with his map score, just showing everybody who will look because he went up so much. Just as proud as he could be. Everybody look! And teachers going, no idea. And I tell them, I said, listen, you love these kids. You don't tolerate them, you love them as your own, and they know that. And they will run through the wall for you because of it. But it's an aha moment for us as believers. The world knows when we love it and want to care for it and make it better, or as we've talked about in Ezekiel in Sunday school, when we are more worried about making dead people alive than trying to make bad people good. When we love people, they understand that. They also know when we're just tolerating them because we're trying to make a check mark in what it is as far as Christianity is considered. We're called to love, not tolerate. That's why this VBS thing has been kind of a struggle, because tolerate tells us just keep VBS the same. They'll come if they come, right? We do what we do. It's their job to adjust to us. The love side tells us, if I could just get 10 more, if I could just get one more here, we go tonight. If I could go from 50 to 51, we go to the evening. They know the difference between love and tolerate. Paul here is showing love. Closing out here, 39. When daylight came, they did not recognize land, but sighted a bay with a beach. They planned to run the ship ashore if they could. After casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea. At the same time, loosening the ropes that held the rudders, they hoisted the foresail to the wind and headed for the beach. But they struck a sandbar, ran the ship aground. The bow jammed fast and remained immovable. But the stern began to break up with the pounding of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that no one could swim off and escape. But the centurion kept them from carrying out their plan because he wanted to save Paul. He knew his job, but at the same time, he's beginning to believe in what Paul is preaching to him. So he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to follow, some on planks, some on debris from the ship. In this way, all got safely to land, exactly as God said they would. What I have written here at the end of this is not what we expect when God does what he does. Because you imagine when Paul says, God told me everybody here is going to be fine. They probably imagined they'd find a port, they'd walk off softly and nicely and everything would be fine. Not you're watching your ship get bashed to death as you make it to land swimming for your life. But God's the God of the details. We trust in that. It's not always going to look like what we want it to look like. It's not always going to feel like we want it to feel like. But it's about us getting out of the way and trusting in who He is. And if you're here today and you find yourself thinking about those guys lower in the skiff, maybe today's the day you need to cut those ropes and step into faith with Jesus for the first time. Maybe you're here and you find yourself just struggling with a God that you don't quite understand. Let me tell you this. All of us in here are still trying to understand too. We're working on it together. If anybody ever tells you they have this entire thing figured out, no. I've studied this book for years. I've looked at the words in it. I have taken master's level classes in it, and every time it slaps me in the face. Just this week, looking at verse 32 for the first time and going, they cut the ropes. Why would they do that? Because they're grasping something for the first time. Maybe you're here and God's calling you to faith for the first time. Let's begin that journey. Maybe you're here and you're already a follower, but you find yourself thinking, I don't know about the details. It's time to trust in the details God has. Maybe you're here and God's just called you into fellowship with our church. We'd love to have you. If you're here, we love you anyway, but maybe God's calling you to make it official. Let's do it. Whatever it is God's calling you to do, I pray that you will be open and attentive, that you will move quickly. With that in mind, let's pray. God, we thank you for today. We thank you for the opportunity to come together to study your word, to look at this example we see of how Paul loved the flock you put under him, and we began to see change in them because they cut the ropes. That we would trust you in the details, both big and small. And if there's one here today that hasn't yet accepted you as Lord and Savior, that maybe they'd step out today and say, I need God, I need Jesus, because He's the God of the details. Maybe there's one here that has accepted you but find themselves just struggling, stuck in trusting who you are, and that maybe they just ask for prayer or pray where they're at to begin that trust again, to renew that trust, to strengthen them. God, for whatever it is you've laid on the hearts in this room, I just pray that we would be open and attentive and do what you've called us to do, because you alone are good, and that we would seek to be like you and not like this world. It's in your name we pray. Amen. If you'll stand with us, church.